If one wants to discover the roots of prosperity of particular states and poverty of others, it is necessary to go deep in the global history and scrutinize it. What made Europe so powerful and wealthy? Why there is a strict difference between North and South Americas? And how did the industry develop and in what way determined the global economy?
These are the questions which Robert Allen discussed in his book Global Economic History, a very short introduction.
So our video aims to highlight the thesis provided by the author in this book and to make it as interesting as it's possible.
Let's start our around the world trip at the beginning.
Allen highlighted that those states which were successful and rich initially remained the leaders eventually, and it can be seen in the example of the Western European states.
They experienced a great boost caused by determination, further globalization and colonization, receiving numerous benefits for their status as the leaders of economic order.
Allen gives a name for this segregation for prosperous and others, and it is called the Great Divergence. And it really helps us to understand why some states which were initially prosperous and powerful managed to preserve their status and others failed to. So it was a really interesting case in Western Europe. However, there was another state which had its own path.
It was an interesting case because this process launched the massive industrialization in the world.
Robert Allen argues that it was England that experienced Industrial Revolution first because of its high wages and low cost for energy, namely coal.
So it was very beneficial for producers to replace expensive labor force with mechanism and machines.
We can thank Industrial Revolution for the general purpose technologies such as steam engine, which can be used in different spheres.
This industrialization bolstered the economy of England, helped to improve transportation and production. As England experienced a breathtaking success, other parts had to either to accept this gap between them and London or to try close it. Everyone chose the second option.
Cotton was one particular good which determined the whole history of Industrial Revolution, and it was England that succeeded mostly in producing it, and other Western European states and all the states all over the world were looking at England with an extent of envy, and of course they realized that it was of paramount importance for them to catch up England, and to do so several principles were introduced. These principles are: first, abolition of all internal tariffs; second, lots of external tariffs and other protectionist measures to preserve and to protect domestic producers from the competition of other states. The third one was massive education, which was of paramount importance to bolster the level of literacy. And the fourth one was national banks that could stabilize the currency.
Now let's see how states and regions use these principles.
So we can see that those states which were prosperous and rich, namely in Western Europe, understood that it was very vital for them to close the gap between them and England, and their high wages helped to do so because many people understood that it was of paramount importance to somehow change the system and replace very expensive labor force with cheap mechanism and machines. And while doing so, they increased the level of capital per worker. This figure shows us a production function, and it can explain what GDP can a state produce with the use of its labor force and capital per one person. We can see that in Western Europe everything went brilliantly, and despite the fact that they had already had some interesting technologies to use which were previously invented by British, they introduced something new, and namely vehicles which ran on petroleum and some other things to improve transportation. And that was one hallmark of Western Europe, because they invented something new. And we can see that this competition was quite beneficial for them. However, not everywhere it worked well.
It is explained by the theory of comparative advantage, which means that countries that trade with each other specialize in the production of commodities that they can produce relatively efficiently.
Those goods and import the ones that they produce relatively inefficiently.
Sounds great, but there were some drawbacks, and the main case is India.
Cotton industry in England eventually made it non-beneficial to produce cotton in India, since it cost more, even regarding the fact that in England clothes were produced by machines and in India with very cheap labor force. India couldn't compete with England in producing cotton clothes, so found its comparative advantage in growing and selling raw cotton for England, which eventually led to the deindustrialization of the state.
But what about Americas? Did they follow the same path of no success?
Not exactly. The economy of the North America started mainly from its exports, which is described by the author with the staple thesis. The economic development of regions like Canada was determined by the growth of their exports, known as staples, such as codfish, furs, and timber. These exports provided the income to purchase manufactured goods from Europe rather than producing them locally due to the efficiency of European industries. The four imperatives mentioned above started to develop even before gaining independence, and as everything worked there properly after, the US became the leader in global industrialization soon. They put protectionist measures into practice, bolstered the level of the literacy, and eventually replaced the expensive labor force with machines. One may ask, did the same happen with Latin America after gaining independence? And I will explain why. First, geography played a crucial role. The huge part of the region could not trade with Europe because of swamps, tropical forests, and mountains that were needed to be crossed in order to reach the nearest port. But the key difference was in governmental policy. If we compare the four imperatives mentioned before with cases of the US and independent Latin America, we will see an overwhelming divergence in the level of their development. It somehow reminds us of the theory of Ajimoglu and Robinson, since there were the difference in institutions' quality that determined the gap between these regions. The US advantages ran from the English system of property rights and courts, legislative and judicial checks on the executive, egalitarianism, but not in the South, democracy and laissez-faire policies. In Latin America, they didn't implement such policies.
Another region which we can unfortunately discuss very briefly is Africa.
No law, low wages, people living in bare-bone subsistence, meaning that they could only afford food and a few other things. Both internal and external slave trade played its role. Moreover, physical geography with a few great rivers, low population density, and plenty diseases left Africa out of the Great Divergence. It was the region to be exploited only by prosperous and powerful states.
After that, we can move and discuss another interesting point of Allen, which can be described as the use of standard model of development, and it was a case in different regions. Let's see how they managed to use it.
In 1850, Europe and North America had pulled ahead of the rest of the world. Independent states, however, could apply the standard model, railways, tariffs, banks, and schools that had worked for the USA and Western Europe.
Many states tried it, and many states failed to reach their goals.
We have the examples of many Latin American states, for instance Argentina with its car industry, and Tsarist Russia, which failed to operate with this standard model. However,
the most successful project was in Japan, especially after its Meiji Restoration. Since wages were low in East Asia, the Japanese invented technology that increased the employment of labor in order to raise the productivity of land, capital, and materials. This helped to develop key sectors like textile, steel, and shipbuilding.
So we have many of the states pretty prosperous, the same with the US, but other big states needed to develop too, and they wanted to do it very quickly by constructing all of the elements of the advanced economy, for example, steel mills, power plants, vehicles, cities, and so on. This is a big push industrialization.
In case of Soviet Union, we see that the solution for this was a central planning, and the 5-year plan became its symbol. There were a lot of good consequences, but the Second World War was a huge blow to the USSR. People died, factories were destroyed, but the capital stock was restored by 1950. What about China? This country adopted a communist system with collective farms and central planning along Soviet lines. There were a lot of reforms, for example, agriculture reform. Industrial sector had reforms as well. Now we can see that China step by step becomes the biggest economy of the world, which is not surprising.
To conclude, this book was very good and we all have found several things which amazed us.
Changes into the people person, which are shown in the tables in the beginning of the book, really surprised me.
I haven't ever thought about the case of price revolution, which was for Spain, for instance. After they discovered huge amounts of silver and gold in Latin America, I didn't think how it influenced the economy of these states and the whole world.
Also, how India shifted from being the major exporter to be a major importer.
And the second thing which surprised me were the reasons for the Industrial Revolution. For example, I didn't know that during that time in Britain there was the cheapest energy in the world, and that it has contributed to the emergence of the revolution.
Moreover, there was another thing which surprised me, and it was the fact that Africans used internal slavery too and managed to put into practice the process of selling themselves to Americans. So it was not like the robbery, they made it like a normal practice for them to sell themselves to another people.
Thanks a ton for watching this video. We really hope that you have enjoyed it, regardless of the fact that we have faced numerous obstacles while filming it, for instance, illnesses and others. Thank you.